Welcome to Public Legal Information. This video will be focusing on COVID-19 and housing protection for tenants. Today we have a guest speaker, Piera Savage, housing lawyer from West Scarborough Community Legal Services, who will be sharing information about tenants' rights and changes to their housing policies. Can you tell us about the services West Scarborough Community Legal Services provides to tenants?
We assist tenants facing eviction by providing advice on how to prepare evidence for a hearing and represent themselves. We occasionally do represent tenants at the tribunal as well. We also give tenants advice on how to file applications against their landlord related to maintenance and repairs issues, illegal fees, illegal rent increases, and many other matters.
I understand there are some policy changes that happen to protect tenants. What are the policy changes that took place to protect tenants during this pandemic?
So in response to COVID-19, the Landlord and Tenant Board has postponed all eviction hearings and will try to do non-eviction hearings by telephone. And this is for the foreseeable future. And the Sheriff's Office has postponed any evictions, so they will not be enforcing any current eviction notices. If a tenant is unable to pay their rent because of COVID-19, they should talk to their landlords about a payment plan, or at least let their landlords know that they are not currently paying their rent because they have lost their job or they've lost a substantial amount of their income in relation to COVID-19. It's possible that landlords will be understanding. It's also possible that landlords will file for eviction once the Landlord and Tenant Board is reopened and is once again hearing eviction applications. At that point in time, a tenant will be able to explain their circumstances and why they were unable to pay the rent in relation to COVID-19. A tenant will also be able to explain any other circumstances that affected their ability to pay rent. It's up to the tribunal at that point to determine what a reasonable payment plan is. That could be a 1-year payment plan, 2-year payment plan. It's really unclear how the tribunal will be dealing with these matters. But it is important for tenants to know that at this point the law says that in order for a tenant to maintain their tenancy once they owe arrears, they have to pay all the rent that is owed. It doesn't have to be all at once. It could be a payment plan, like I've said, but the expectation is that rent will be paid eventually. Currently, the sheriff's offices will postpone enforcement of any current eviction orders.
What are some of the basic rights of tenants in Ontario?
The Residential Tenancy Act provides protection to residential units. Tenants who live with the owner or leaseholder are generally not protected by the Residential Tenancy Act. The Residential Tenancy Act allows for security of tenure. That means, for example, if a tenant has a lease agreement, which can be written, implied, or verbal, they continue to live on a month-to-month basis at the end of that agreement, unless they decide to move out. Tenants have to give 60 days notice to their landlord. A landlord can only evict a tenant in certain circumstances and must give a tenant written notice with a detailed explanation for the reason of the eviction in the proper form by the Landlord and Tenant Board. This can't be a handwritten letter, a text message, or verbal. Landlords are entitled also to a standard lease. If a landlord doesn't provide a tenant with a standard lease, then the tenant should ask for it in writing. If the landlord doesn't provide it within 21 calendar days, then the tenant can hold 1 month's rent. If after the tenant has withheld rent, after 30 calendar days, a tenant can keep that withheld rent. If a tenant still doesn't receive the lease, then they can end their fixed term lease early. Please contact your local legal clinic for more information on this. In terms of rent, a landlord can only raise the rent once a year by the guideline amount with 90 days notice. However, new buildings and new basements that were occupied for the first time for residential purposes after November 15th are exempt from rent control. However, new buildings, additions to existing buildings, and most new basement apartments that are occupied for the first time after November 15th, 2018 are exempt from this rent control.
Could you tell us if landlords can evict tenants for not paying rent?
Yes, a landlord can evict a tenant if the tenant owes the landlord rent. However, the landlord has to follow certain steps. A landlord first has to give a tenant a notice called an N4 with a date by which the tenant is asked to pay rent. This date is called the termination date. A landlord must give this notice to the tenant at least 14 days before the termination date if rent is paid on a monthly basis. A tenant doesn't have to move out by the termination date. If the tenant pays all that the notice says they owe, then the landlord cannot evict the tenant if it's paid by the termination date. If the tenant can't pay the rent by that date, the landlord can apply to the Landlord and Tenant Board for eviction. The Landlord and Tenant Board will schedule a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board. At the tribunal, a tenant can sign up for mediation with a board mediator. At the tribunal, a tenant can first sign up for mediation before going to a hearing to see if they can come up with a payment plan with their landlord. If they can come up with an agreement, then they can get what's called a consent order by the Landlord and Tenant Board, which just sets out the terms that the landlord and tenant have agreed on for the payment plan. If the landlord doesn't agree to a payment plan, then a tenant actually has to have a hearing at the tribunal. The landlord will provide evidence of why they want to evict the tenant, and the tenant will provide evidence of why they should not be evicted. A tenant needs to pay all the rent that they owe plus the filing fee that the landlord had to pay in order to file this eviction at the tribunal in order for their tenancy to continue. If a tenant has had issues with their landlords related to repairs and maintenance, then they can bring these issues up at the tribunal and ask for their rent to be decreased. If a tenant has had issues with their landlord, such as repair and maintenance or harassment, illegal lockout, there are lots of other issues, then they can bring these matters to the tribunal and ask for rent to be decreased until the problems are fixed. It's really important to also explain to the tribunal why eviction should be delayed or refused by explaining any relevant circumstances, like a lost job, disability, unexpected expenses, if a tenant is a single parent, any sort of circumstances that help explain why the tenant hasn't been able to pay their rent, and propose a payment plan that they can stick to. A current relevant reason might be something like losing your job because of COVID-19. That will be a very relevant piece of information if you are unable to pay your rent during this time.
What are other reasons a tenant can be evicted for?
A tenant can be evicted for very limited reasons. Some examples are interfering with others, damage, overcrowding, illegal acts, causing serious problems in the unit, paying rent late. That's right, just paying it late. Even if a tenant doesn't owe rent, if they pay the rent late multiple times in a year, a tenant can be evicted on that basis. Generally speaking, in that circumstance, the landlord will allow the tenant to continue their tenancy if they agree that they will pay the rent on the first every single month for a year. And if they don't pay the rent on the first, or if they're $1 short, then the landlord can apply to evict them without giving notice to the tenant. So it's important, if possible, to pay rent on the first or whatever date that you have agreed to in your lease. A tenant can also be evicted if the landlord or landlord's family member or a new purchaser wants to move into the unit. A landlord can also apply for eviction if they want to demolish, repair, or convert the unit to another use.
If a landlord does not follow the law, what can the tenant do?
If a tenant is illegally locked out by their landlord, meaning that the landlord changes the locks when they leave the unit, then it's really important for that tenant to, number one, call the police And right now, while the tribunal is suspended, to number 2, call the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit. So the Rental Housing Enforcement Unit is part of the Ministry of Housing. Its job is to try to make sure that landlords and tenants follow the law. They can be reached at 1-888-722-9277 or for 416 or locally 416-585-7214. A tenant can also, in this circumstance, file what's called a T2 application at the Landlord and Tenant Board and mark their application as urgent. They should also get in touch with their local legal clinic ASAP to assist them with this matter. The Toronto Rent Bank program, which is administered through Neighbourhood Information Post, is available to any low-income household who has not able to pay April rent because of the pandemic. They will provide interest-free loans to eligible households and a very flexible repayment plan. Tenants who need assistance with April rent should call 416-924-2543 and leave a message. Their staff is currently working remotely, but will get back to tenants within 24 hours and will do their best to make direct payments to landlords as soon as possible.
Thank you, Piera, for your time and valuable information on this matter. Housing is a human right. If you like to get involved, please visit West Scarborough Community Legal Services website. The link will be in the description box below. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to this channel for more legal information. Stay informed.